Imagine sitting in a hospital waiting room. The chairs are hard. The air smells faintly of antiseptic. A television hums in the corner, but nobody is watching it. You've been sitting there for 2 hours. Your name hasn't been called. And the weight you've been carrying, the quiet exhaustion of holding it all together, feels heavier today than it has in weeks. You stare at the floor. You don't want to talk to anyone. And then someone sits down beside you. They don't say anything at first. They just sit. But something about the way they hold themselves, the slight tension in their jaw, the way their hands rest quietly in their lap, feels oddly familiar. Like looking into a mirror you didn't know was there. Minutes pass. Then, one of you speaks. What happens next? In that waiting room, in that conversation, in the days and weeks that follow, would later be studied by researchers across multiple institutions. The results were something scientists described as quietly remarkable, because what began as two strangers sharing a plastic chair in a fluorescent-lit hallway would reveal something profound about the human body, the human brain, and the ancient, almost invisible force that connects people who have walked the same difficult road. The question researchers couldn't stop asking was this: why do some people seem to carry their struggle with less visible weight after encountering someone who shares it? And what is actually happening, biologically, neurologically, in that moment when a stranger says, "I know exactly what you mean"? Her name, for the purposes of this story, doesn't matter. What matters is she had been navigating something difficult alone for nearly 18 months. Not dramatic in a visible way. Not the kind of struggle that prompts people to bring casseroles to your door. The quiet kind. The kind where you smile at colleagues, meet your deadlines, answer messages, and then sit in your car in the parking garage for 15 minutes before you can find the energy to drive home. She had told very few people, partly because she couldn't find the words, partly because every time she tried, the person she was talking to would nod with a kind expression and say something like, "I can imagine how hard that must be." And she would smile and say thank you and feel, somehow, even more alone than before. That day in the waiting room, she wasn't looking for connection. She was simply waiting. The man who sat beside her was older, gray at his temples. He had a paper cup of coffee that had clearly gone cold. He glanced at her once, briefly, with the specific, unmistakable expression of someone who has been sitting in waiting rooms for a long time, not impatient, but accustomed. Resigned in a way that only experience produces. They made small talk first. The way strangers do, the bad parking, the weather, the general injustice of waiting rooms everywhere. And then, somehow, the way it sometimes does, the conversation shifted. One honest sentence led to another. Within 20 minutes, they were talking in a way that she later described as unlike any conversation she'd had in recent memory. Not because either what I needed, not because either of them had answers, not because the man said anything particularly wise or insightful, but because he understood without needing it explained, because she didn't have to translate herself, because for the first time in 18 months, she wasn't performing okayness for someone who couldn't quite reach her. She described it later as a physical sensation, a loosening somewhere in her chest, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Researchers, it turns out, have a very specific explanation for exactly that feeling. What happens in the brain and body when two people share the same kind of struggle is not simply emotional. It is measurably biological. Published research from Cambridge University and reviewed extensively through PubMed found that peer support, specifically connection between people with shared lived experience, is associated with significant improvements in personal recovery outcomes and measurable reductions in anxiety symptoms. A meta-analysis examining 49 randomized controlled trials involving over 12,000 participants found consistent positive effects when people with similar challenges were connected with one another, compared to those who received only standard, individual support. But the neuroscience goes deeper than clinical outcomes. Research conducted at Stanford University's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences revealed something extraordinary about a neuropeptide called oxytocin. Often called the bonding molecule, oxytocin is produced deep in the brain in a structure called the hypothalamus and released into the bloodstream and across multiple brain regions during moments of genuine social connection. What the Stanford researchers found, published in the journal Science, is that oxytocin doesn't just make us feel warm toward others. It actively fires the brain's reward circuitry, the same system activated by food, safety, and the satisfaction of belonging. Social connection, the study concluded, is neurologically coded as a survival reward. This is not metaphor, it is biology. But what makes shared experience specifically so powerful goes one layer deeper still. To a class of brain cells that neuroscientists have called, at times, the most socially significant discovery in modern neuroscience: mirror neurons. First identified by neuroscientists studying primate neural pathways, and later confirmed in human brain imaging studies at UCLA and across multiple institutions. Mirror neurons are cells that activate both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing the same action. They are the neurological basis of the feeling of being understood. When researchers at University College London used fMRI imaging to observe brain activity during pain empathy, they found that the same regions of the anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex that activate during first-hand pain also activate when a person witnesses someone they feel connected to experiencing pain. In other words, your brain doesn't fully distinguish between your own experience and that of someone you deeply recognize as like you. When the woman in the waiting room felt that loosening in her chest, that involuntary exhale, her nervous system was doing something measurable. The presence of someone who truly understood, according to research published in the World Journal of Biology, Pharmacy, and Health Sciences, citing multiple NIH-reviewed studies, is associated with the release of oxytocin, which in turn decreases activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear and threat response center, and reduces cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone. The body, quite literally, downregulates its alarm system in the presence of someone who shares its experience. She wasn't imagining that breath. Her biology was responding to something real. This phenomenon, the biological response to encountering a shared struggle, is not unique to humans, it is ancient, documented across species, woven into the evolutionary fabric of social animals. Researchers studying elephant herds in the wild have documented what can only be described as communal acknowledgement of distress. When one elephant displays signs of agitation or grief, standing apart from the herd, making low rumbling sounds, moving erratically, other members of the herd will approach, touch the distressed animal with their trunks, and stand beside it, sometimes for hours. Elephants that experience this kind of sustained social presence from others, according to documented field observations by wildlife researchers, show measurable reductions in distress behavior over shorter periods than those who are isolated. In 2017, scientists studying prairie voles, a small North American rodent that mates for life, made a discovery that lit up neuroscience labs around the world. Published in Science and involving researchers from Stanford University, the study found that when one vole was exposed to a stressful experience and then reunited with its bonded partner, the partner vole's consoling behavior, grooming, close physical proximity, shared stillness, was driven by the same oxytocin pathways identified in human social bonding. The relieved animal's stress hormone levels dropped measurably, not because the danger had passed, but because it was no longer alone with it. These animals were not exchanging words. They were not telling each other it would be okay. They were simply present with one another in the particular, irreplaceable way that only shared experience makes possible. There is something the data keeps pointing toward. Something that sits just underneath the clinical outcomes and the brain scans and the neuropeptide studies. The longest-running study of adult human well-being ever conducted, the Harvard study of adult development, which followed hundreds of individuals across more than 8 decades of their lives, reached a conclusion that its lead researchers described as both simple and extraordinary. The quality of a person's relationships was the single strongest predictor of how well they aged, how resilient they were to hardship, and how meaningfully they experienced their lives. Not wealth, not status, not even physical health. Connection. Over 8 decades of data proved that the individuals who had the warmest, most secure relationships at age 50 were consistently the healthiest at age 80. What protected people across decades was not what they had achieved, but who they felt truly seen by. What peer support research, now comprising thousands of studies across PubMed, the Cochrane Library, and the Psychiatric Services Journal, consistently finds is not that shared experience removes difficulty. It doesn't. The struggle remains. The waiting room is still a waiting room. The circumstances haven't changed. What changes is something more fundamental, something the research describes as perceived isolation, the degree to which a person experiences their struggle as something they are carrying entirely alone. According to findings published through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, reviewed by the National Institute of Mental Health, the perception of isolation in the context of chronic challenge is itself a significant stressor. Independent of the challenge itself, it activates the same neurological threat responses as physical danger. The brain reads aloneness in certain contexts as a survival risk, and this is why the moment of recognition, the moment one person says to another, wordlessly or otherwise, "I have been exactly where you are," carries such biological weight. It is not merely comforting. It is, in the most literal neurological sense, disarming. Researchers studying post-traumatic growth, the documented phenomenon in which people who have navigated profound adversity report meaningful psychological expansion as a result, consistently find that connection with others who share the experience is one of the most reliable catalysts. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of someone who has carried it too. The man from the waiting room and the woman he sat beside did not become lifelong friends. They exchanged numbers. They spoke once more, briefly, a few weeks later, and then life did what life does, and the connection faded the way most waiting room conversations do. But she said, years later, that something had shifted that afternoon in a way she still couldn't fully articulate, not because anything had been solved, not because anything had been said that she hadn't already thought, but because for 60 minutes in a plastic chair, under fluorescent light, she had not been a person carrying something alone. And her brain, her ancient, social, connection-seeking brain, had registered that not as comfort, but as something closer to oxygen. The science tells us that we are not built for isolation. We are built for recognition. We are built, at the deepest neurological level, to find other people who have walked the same road and to feel, in their presence, something that no medication, no achievement, Exactly what I needed, and no amount of solitude can replicate. The researchers who studied these encounters called the results quietly remarkable. We think the right word is simply human. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think of someone you know, or something you've carried, we explore these connections every week on this channel. The science of how we find each other, and what happens when we do.